Okay, I think it started. Perfect. All right. So, first of all, good evening, good morning, good afternoon from wherever you're joining us from. We did like a couple of paper readings before, but then we stopped, and now we're sort of reviving the whole paper readings, and we're starting off with Data2vec. In case you're looking for the URL to the paper itself, it's linked in the slides, which are shared in the ML4 Audio um, paper. Just couple of quick points. This is supposed to be a paper reading, so I really don't want this to be like a one-way session of sort. This is not a session at all. This is a discussion. I've put together some rough slides, and the intention is that as and when we go through these slides, at the end of each slide, we sort of like discuss what exactly happened in the paper, and talk about what happened post Data2vec, what happened pre-Data2vec, and compare results. Data2vec is a multimodal model. However, I will be focusing quite a lot on the speech aspects of it. There would be some, there would definitely be some aspects of text as well as CV, which I'll cover, which I thought were really interesting. But by and large, this would be focused on speech. Um, so before we get started, are there any questions or any initial thoughts, comments that anyone would like to share? Okay. Um, no worries, but at any point from now on, you can just um, unmute yourself and just like share your thoughts if you want to. Let's get started. When I read the paper Data2vec, initially my whole like thought process was that hey, this is like a completely novel architecture of its own. However, Data2vec is a framework, right? So it is essentially a way through which you can use the same learning method for all the three modalities. So for speech, natural language processing, and computer vision, right? Data2vec essentially builds on how Wave2vec 2.0 worked. If you remember that, just a quick recap, the way Wave2vec 2.0 worked was by trying to predict the latent representation of the input data, um, uh, you know, um, of the input data. So essentially, the model learns from itself, right? And Data2vec basically takes the same process and removes some complexity of quantization from it. We'll get to that later, but essentially simplifies the learning object a bit more and then applies it across all the three modalities, right? So it does the same thing for speech, it does the same thing for NLP, does the same thing for computer vision, right? So this was the first framework at its time to uh, to be able to come up with a way to use the same learning method. Before Data2vec, there were like state-of-the-art learning methods or like objective functions, as you may call it, for individual modalities. For example, for speech, there is Hubert type learning, wherein like you learn from iterations of model, or Wave2vec 2.0 type learning, wherein you do quantization and have like specific code books from where you learn uh, selections from. Similarly, for like natural language processing, there is of course mass language modeling, and then like different variations of it, and similarly for computer vision as well, right? But this here is an attempt to essentially unify the objective function, and then sort of make the model learn on different modalities, right? And we'll get to the architecture in just about one or two slides, but the core idea here again is to just predict the latent representations of the full input data, um, based on a masked view of the input, right? So it uses a teacher student architecture, wherein the teacher at any given point of time will have the full view of what the input is, and the student gets a masked view of that input and is supposed to predict what exactly is the the masked view of the input, right? Um, if this did not make sense right now, it will make more sense as we go through couple more slides, right? Now let's dig a bit more deeper, right? So what exactly is happening over here, right? So um, if we look at the three different modalities, right? They have like very different subunits. So for example, um, for text, a subunit would either be a word or a subword. For an image, it would either be like a patch on the image, or some sort of a visual token. For human speech, it could be just like a 20 millisecond snippet of it, which may or may not have like one entire unit, and so on. So all of these are like um, really different from each other. More than that, all of these individual modality specific targets, as the paper calls it, are really dependent on the context that surrounds it, right? A very simple example of this from a speech standpoint would be that when we speak, the pronunciation, or like the way we speak, differs based on what surrounds the word, right? For example, honest, in the word honest, we don't really pronounce the word h. That's because like o is in the vicinity of the um, letter h, right? And there are like multiple examples like that. So what is important is that we figure out a way to like, one, learn this context, right? And while we learn this context, also become like really good at like understanding what exactly are we predicting, right? And that's what data 2vec attempts at doing. So it attempts at predicting the contextual latent representations, right? And we'll get to how it gets to the contextual part. But a lot of um, recent architectures, they have been doing self-supervised learning, right? So what they would typically do um, right now would be to just take one layer, or like the last layer of the network, and try to mask that and try to predict that, right? That may or may not be the best layer, and so on. And what data 2vec does is it essentially takes an average representation across layers, and they did some aberration study on that, which we'll also cover in a bit, um, to then like get like an averaged contextual latent representation that the model learns to predict. Um, so I'm going to take a quick pause here and see if we have any questions. Okay, no questions are good questions as well. um, okay, so let's go a little bit more deeper into this, right? What exactly is happening here, right? So as we've figured out so far, that data 2vec unifies the learning algorithm, um, for across the three modalities. However, the way it works presently, it still learns like the representations individually, right? So it uses the same learning function, right? However, it's not as if that you're feeding image, text, and speech all to it at the same time, and it's learning from all three of those at the same time. Rather, it uses the same objective function but learns individually, right? So this is like a step in the direction of learning everything all in one go. However, the work still requires you to have three individual models, right? So there would be one model which employs the same learning function, but for speech. There would be one model which employs the same learning function, but for CV, and for text, and so on, right? Um, but the key part is the learning algorithm over here. Right now, we've been talking about this learning algorithm for quite a while. What exactly is this learning algorithm, right? Um, um, this learning algorithm is basically the method which combines mask prediction. So this is something which all of us know, or like have been sort of reading about from pre-BERT era, as well, and more from like BERT era, um, which is to um, make the model sort of learn to predict the gaps in a target representation, right? So this method essentially um, feeds in a target representation, a masked target representation to the student model, and or well, to the model while it learns, and then the model learns to predict what exactly should be there in place of the mask, right? Um, the model or the architecture here being a transformer architecture, right? Um, and how does it do that? So it does it in like two steps, right? The first step is that you build representation of the full input data. So like whatever your input sample is, you build the representation for the entire data. And you know, this is done using a teacher model. So we'll get to the difference between the teacher model and the student model in a bit, but right now just assume that a teacher model is a black box, and the teacher model essentially takes in the input data and gives you some sort of an embedding, or you know, a representation of the input data out, right? And then there is a student model. Let's also assume that this is a black box for now. This takes the masked version of the representation that the teacher model gives, and then tries to predict the full data, right? So one thing to note over here, that you would have realized that unlike masked language modeling and so on, wherein the model tries to just predict the mask, over here the student model essentially predicts the entire data representation, right? So um, it also learns the dependencies that are uh, you know, before and after the mask as well, right? So the model is forced to predict the entire data representation instead of just filling the blanks, right? And this to me was a really interesting point in the entire paper. um, Before we get to the teacher and the student mode, I'm going to take a quick pause to see if there are any questions here or any thoughts or comments about this. Perfect. Let's look at the architecture in a bit more detail, right? So um, we spoke about two things so far. One is the learning algorithm, which is same across modalities, and the second is that it has a student teacher training model, right? Teacher gives the entire representation of the input data, whereas student gets a masked version of that and tries to predict the full data representation from it, right? Now, what exactly is the teacher and the student here? The teacher and the student have the same architecture, except the weights of the teacher model um, are are essentially initialized with an exponentially decaying average of the student model. So think of it as the student model is always one step ahead of the teacher model, right? So during every, you know, iteration of learning, um, the teacher model weights are initialized to the previous student model. You can, like, that's a great way to sort of put the analogy, right? So that's how the self supervised learning sort of happens, right? So the teacher model is essentially um, um, an exponentially decaying averaged, like has the same architecture and everything is the same, except it is like, um, just think of it as like one epoch behind the student model, and then like the student model tries to sort of, you know, knowing what it knows, tries to like learn more from it, right? And this keeps on like interchanging and so on and so forth. I hope that gives you a good picture of it, right? In case that was not clear, let's look at this diagram from the paper. So what it does is that we have, let's take for example speech over here. So we have the original. This is the entire waveform, right? And there would be some representation of this waveform, um, which we will get from a feature encoder. Um, in a bit, we'll get to what the feature encoders are, but assuming that they are a black box, we get a representation of this waveform, and then we you know, mask this representation, right? This representation then is like um, fed to the student model, right? Which then tries to you know, predict the the entire representation of the original input in itself, right? And because the teacher model is essentially a weight decaying average um, of the student model. um, the teacher tracks the weights, right? So now you can sort of understand it more from like epoch to epoch, or like one entire pass of data to the other entire pass of data. You can see that the student model in like one generation, if I may call it, becomes the teacher model for the next generation, right? For the next pass of data, and so on. So um, your teacher also becomes like stronger as the passes of the data go through, and your student of course is like one step ahead of that. So it gets better because it gets better at predicting the overall representation of the original input. um, Right. And uh, one thing to note over here is that um, since the different modalities, so modalities being the images, speech, and the language, have like really different inputs. In one case it's pixel, in the other case it's actually a waveform, in the other one there are like words. um, uh, the data-to-vec framework employs modality specific feature encoders, and there are also like different masking strategies that they involve, but by and large they are um, sort of like relatable in itself. But the key thing to note here is that the way we create these representations that the student model is supposed to learn is different for each of the modality. So I know I've been talking quite a lot of gibberish. So I'm going to take a quick pause to see if we have any um, discussion point here or something to talk about here. Okay, let's get going. Um, I think um, one thing in this slide which truly did not really make um, sense to me that much, and especially like when I was just like reading it for the first time, was that in this kind of a setup, like wherein the teacher model is essentially learning from the student model, um, you know as well, there is a really high chance of collapse, right, while learning. So there could be a scenario wherein like a bias creeps into the prediction of student model, and that bias could just like quite very well easily um, um, be like flow in throughout the training iteration. So um, I wasn't quite sure, what's the best way one to avoid it, or it is, or if um, it is a problem in the first place. But yeah, I still don't have an answer to it. If in case anyone has an answer or has any thoughts on that, then feel free to unmute yourself, and um, we can discuss. But cool. We can let's get let's get going, and feel free to pause me at any point. So um, I like up until now, um, we've we've looked at the overall architecture of Data2vec. We've seen that it can handle different modalities. However, we did learn that it uses modality specific feature encoders, and the masking strategy is different as well. And we also learned that it works in a student teacher mode. Um, and learns to predict the overall representation. But what does this actually mean with respect to speech, right? So if you compare Data2vec with Wave2vec 2.0, Data2vec um, predicts the contextual latent representations directly, right? So in Wave2vec 2.0, in case if you remember, there was a quantization step, right? The quantization step was for the model to explicitly learn the hidden units of speech, right? And quick refresher, the reason why we need to learn these units of speech is so that you know because speech is not like text, right? So you cannot really like split speech into 10 millisecond sections or 20 millisecond sections and say that this 20 millisecond section corresponds to A, or this section corresponds to C or D, or and so on. So that's why we need to learn how exactly do these, like we have to learn these speech spoken language units, right? And what data2vec does is it removes the quantization section, and it directly just learns to predict the contextualized latent representations. So it in a sense it removes the complexity that quantization had in wave2vec 2.0, which also resulted in it being a sort of unstable model when it comes to pre-training as well. So data2vec is in it in itself sort of like simplified wave2vec 2.0, right? And the other sort of state of the art model, which is Hubert, the way it is different from Hubert to data2vec is Hubert essentially uses different layers across like iterations. So it does two iterations, and um, it uses the representations from those layers to predict um, these representations, whereas data2vec predicts the average over multiple layers, right? So um, like a quick sort of quick point here. Uh, there have been multiple researches specifically in speech which say that for example for models like wave2vec 2.0 or for Hubert, the last layer of the model isn't really the best representation of the input data to it, like doesn't really give you the best representation, right? That's why in the case of Hubert, they zeroed down on the eighth layer of the network, and for like the small model, and I think the 12th for the large model. I may be getting the exact layer wrong, and whatnot. But what data2vec does is it averages the results over multiple layers, and they did some ablation studies on like how many layers are the best number of layers and so on. But that sort of helps remove the bias of just using the best layer that they found during their experiments, right? So in this case, they actually did some meaningful analysis to see what k sort of works best. K meaning how many number of layers do we switch from. So by now you would have realized that there are, if you were to draw like direct parallels from wave2vec 2.0, um, data2vec is pretty much the same as wave2vec 2.0, except with a different um, learning strategy, right? Like except with a different learning function. Wave2vec 2.0 had a very different learning function, and in this one we're just like predicting the full contextual latent representation, right? Without any need for quantization or any need for synthetic generation of um, uh, spoken language units as well. Um, right. So before we get to the architecture, um, we'll take another pause and see if we have any thoughts, questions, or comments. And in case you don't want to unmute yourself, you can also just um, ping on the Discord chat as well. Okay, let's talk architecture now. So the architecture is basically the standard transformer architecture. However, the interesting thing over here is that each and every modality has a separate feature encoder, right? And the reason for that is quite simple, because each modality has a really different um, input, right? So, for example, in case of computer vision, we have images. In case of speech, we have waveforms, whereas in case of text, it's just like one dimensional text. So whilst the learning method was is the same across all modalities. The way we generate representations are different still, right? So for computer vision, they use with specific strategy. So they encode the image as a sequence of patches, and each spans across 16 cross 16, and it's input to a linear transformation. I am not familiar with or computer vision that much, so I just took this directly from the paper. For speech, it pretty much copies how Wave2Vec 2.0 works. So it works on the waveform, so it does not require any MEL spectrogram representation or something like that as Hubert requires. So it directly models the waveform, and it has the exact same multi-layer convolution network to to take like 25 millisecond waveform snippets and downsample it. In case of text, they use subword units, and if I'm not mistaken, they use a Roberta architecture to um, you know feature encode um, the to get the input. Sorry, to get the representation of the input data. So again, there's nothing novel in the architecture itself, but the novelty is in the learning um function or the objective function um, over here. And across across modalities, when it comes to masking, again, like the input sample, it goes through um, it goes through it is sorry, I got lost for a second. The input sample is embedded and as a sequence token, of course, right? And we get like some sort of a representation out of the feature encoder out from it, and this representation then is masked. So roughly they aim to mask around like 0.65 um, uh, like 65% of the data, and like then have the model sort of the learn to predict the overall representation. Um, and yeah, so once the masked embedding token is in place within the sequence, then it is fed back into the student model for it to predict the overall um, sequence, right? So again, nothing novel over here. The way they mask sort of differs from like speech to text um, to image. However, uh, the fact that it is 65% masked still remains the same. I can hear myself for some reason. Does anyone have anything to say, discuss, or questions? Hmm. Um, anyway, I'm just going to ignore that for now. So um, then now that's like masking. So that's what that's what the model is sort of learning, and then comes the training targets. So now, as we learned, the training targets are essentially um, the representations, however, like mass representation. So you're essentially learning the entire learning to predict the entire representation in itself, right? Um, and like one important point over here is that the representations that we predict um, um, in this entire sort of setup, these are contextual representations, right? So any particular like like when we give the input to the student model, it is for a particular time step. However, like the transformer architecture has like self attention sort of embedded in it. So each and every one of those sample would have information, like each and every one of those time steps samples would have information of the entire sort of input, right? So in that sense, the model is just not like learning to fill the blanks. However, like the model learns to sort of generate quote unquote the entire representation given like whatever little information it has from the masked representation, right? So that's kind of the important bit over here as well. Um, then we get to the objective function. The objective function is sort of a smooth L1 loss, and it progresses across all the targets. So the 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 targets here are like different time steps, so you essentially want to get the value for that time step right, and so on. And they introduce a beta value over here, which is this one. And the reason why we have this, can I have, oh okay, so now I have a cool fancy laser pointer. This beta value is here to essentially make the model um, less likely to collapse in the event of outliers, right? Um, and you would have probably guessed this, right? That this beta is also a tunable parameter over here, and it would differ a bit from, say, for example, a speech um, training setup to say an image, and so on. And the reason why this is important is we want the model to uh, not explicitly not learn how to interpolate, right? What is in a self-supervised setup, what is quite easy for the architecture to learn is, given the previous time step, it just like interpolates the next thing. So the model essentially learns like a next step prediction of of model to learn that. We want the model like um, to like learn everything that there is within the sample, and like learn to predict the entire sample from just like one time steps, and so on, right? And that's why having a beta value over here to sort of control the transition helps quite a lot. um, right, so before we get into a bit more details about speech and then like look at the results, I'm going to take a quick pause to see if we have any thoughts or comments. Oh yeah, perfect. Yeah, I mean, if anyone has any thoughts, then feel free to share them, or just unmute yourself and just talk at any point of time. In terms of the presentation or in terms of the slides, we're almost near the end, so we can also discuss some cool stuff which I found in the paper. And you can always just unmute yourself and say, hey, this does not make sense, and why did they not do say X instead why did they choose Y as well? So um, uh, any sort of questions are good questions, in case I wasn't clear. um, cool. So now that we've spoken, or now that we've looked at the overall architecture, right? So far, let's look at specifically from like a speech standpoint, what exactly is happening here, right? Um, so long story short, everything's exactly same as Wave2Vec 2.0 except the learning function. But to break it down into the three parts, the feature encoder is the same as Wave2Vec 2.0. Even in the Hugging Face implementation of Data2vec, they use this like same Wave2Vec 2.0 um, feature encoder. The the masking strategy is the same as well. So even though they aim for 0.65, but when you when you take into account the silences and stuff like that, it comes down to like 49% um, of all time steps were masked. for the training sequence. The fine tuning strategy is also the same as Wave2Wave 2.0. This is same across all modalities, right? The bit that I really liked about Data2vec is it reduces the complexity of quantization. So essentially makes learning quite easy, and also like makes the whole like pre-training less likely to collapse when compared to Wave2Wave 2.0. But while doing that, while reducing the complexity, it also beats Wave2Wave 2.0, right? So it's basically a win-win with very less sort of changes to the overall training mechanism, right? And let's look at the results. So I've only put the results for speed stuff um, because I thought like that was more relevant over here. But you can already see that we have to like for so what this table is showing you right now is base models and large models for like Wave2Vec 2.0, Hubert, WaveLM, and compare them with Data2vec, right? Um, and what kind of language model was used as well. And what you see from here all the way till the end of the table are word error rates. So word error rates are general, like the lower the word error rate, the more precise and the more accurate your model is, right? Um, and this is the amount of label data that was supplied to the model um, to train. So all of these models were pre-trained on the entire 960 hours Libre speech dataset, and then they were fine-tuned only on 10 minutes, then 1 hour, then 10 hours, then 100 hours, then then again like 960 hours of data to then get um, their final word error rate, right? And you can like there are like a couple of things which become like really clear right off the bat, right? So one area where Data2vec excels is at less like when you have less amount of data. So if you compare 12 point like the word error rate of 12.3 with Wave2Wave 2.0's 15.6 over here, or Hubert's 15.3, that's a massive improvement in my opinion, right? And that too, given the fact that it has a significantly less complex um, um, you know uh, learning mechanism as compared to say Wave2Wave 2.0 or Hubert, as a matter of fact, right? Um, when we go to the large model for the same amount of less data, less data, you can see that there is also like some improvement here. So it's 8.4 over here, and it was 10.3 for Wave2Wave 2.0, and 10.1 for Hubert. And mind it, like all of these models were pre-trained on the same amount of unlabeled data, use the same language model. So they are being compared one to one over here. And also because Wave2Wave 2.0 and Hubert as well as Data2vec by and large have the same architecture as well in terms of like the future encoder, the um, 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 uh, yeah, I mean like in terms of the layers. So it's not that one model has like significantly large number of parameters and the other one does not. So it's quite one-to-one comparison when it comes to that. You can also see for like 1 hour, there is like at least a 2 point word error rate uh, gain, right? Same for 10 hours as well, same for 100 hours as well, for 960 hours as well, and so on. I honestly don't really see the point of like putting 960 hours over here because well you've already like pre-trained on 960 hours of unlabeled data anyway, right? So you're essentially just like reinforcing whatever is your model learned during the pre-training phase, right? So I don't think so. This is that valuable. However, my key takeaway from the entire thing was that Data2vec models using Data2vec framework, trained using the Data2vec framework, are significantly better at low amount of data. So if you have like very less amount of data and just want to quickly test how the performance would be on like downstream ASR tasks, or speaker verification tasks, or something like that, then this might be the way to go, at least for now. Gonna take a quick pause to see if we have any thoughts, comments, questions here? Nice. Let's head over to well, the conclusion and also some part of the future work, right? Like, of course, I think the authors did a fantastic job to sort of talk about how self-supervised learning can be used. Like the framework can be used across like vision, speech, and language. Of course, their idea of not just like predicting what the mask is, but also like predicting the entire latent representation given a partial view is also quite novel. um, and this is something which can be just applied to like some other like modality specific architectures, and could give like really nice results straight off the bat. And a couple of things which I found really interesting in their future work was that they said that they would want to see like how this kind of a setup would work for, say, for example, audio visual speech recognition, right, wherein you have like same sort of masking across both the image input as well as the audio input, and have some sort of a similar feature encoder for both of them to see like how this kind of a learning mechanism performs over there. They also spoke a bit you know about investigating single masking strategy, so like modality agnostic masking strategy. um, um, as in this case they had slightly different um, methodology. So just having like similar masking strategy might be like the first step towards having like a universal feature encoder for like all different types of modalities in this particular setup. um, so that was the that was the that was a quick down low on what Data2vec does. Before I sort of like um, open the floor for discussion, and like I do want to sort of discuss the ablation studies and the results of that. If you want to test out the Data2vec model on Hugging Face, there are about 42 different models right now. And there are some models which are specifically fine tuned for text, and for like specific corporas within text as well. So do make sure to check them out. If you want to just directly test the ASR model, you can just go to the link that I've put in the slides, and just test them out, and it should work right off the bat as well. So with that, I am gonna uh, take a pause and see if we have any questions, thoughts, comments, discussion points over here. Nice. So then maybe we like quickly check the ablation studies, because that to me was probably the best part of the paper. I did not have the time to put this in the slides, but maybe before I share the slides on the or like upload the slides on GitHub, I add that as well for like future viewing. But what they did was they essentially, so let me first um, zoom in a bit. I hope it's visible. I'm sorry if it isn't. I am on a low resolution monitor right now. But they did like they ran 2 or 3 different types of layer ablation studies. So one was on like how many number of layers should they use um, when they're like predicting the contextual latent representations, or like how many layers, what do you predict, like how many number of layers do you like average essentially. And if you see here, k is the number of layers. So you can see that when you just use the last layer, or when you just use like one layer or two layer, the word error rate is incredibly high. So it's like all the way up to like 40, or like in this case, I don't know, something around 48, or something like that. But it like significantly goes down as you go from like the fourth to fifth one, right? And then like further from like fifth to sixth. And yeah, if you use all, then it's like, of course, like sort of like bottoms around 8, if I'm not wrong, and then pretty much follows the same aspect. So for speech, it does have like a considerable um, uh, you know considerable change when you take like more layers into consideration. Whereas for like natural language processing, or like for like text-based tasks, you can see that the glue score sort of Im- improves or like increases quite sort of um, quite a lot from like the first to the second layer, and then like a bit more from third, and then after that there's like minimum sort of increase. um, for vision, it increases or like peaks at three number of layers, and then like sort of decreases and plateaus towards the end. I'm not sure why this happens. My non-speech background, sorry, my non-image background like prohibited me to understand what the reason behind this is. But if any one of you know image, um, or like have worked with image related tasks, and have like a thought or like some idea as to why this is happening, then feel free to unmute yourself and talk about it. Right. And um, also the next thing that they tried was like how much how much contextualization should happen in the target, right? Um, so like how much of the target should the model or like the student model try to predict, right? um, and as you can see, like the word error rate, of course, like improves considerably when you try to predict everything, right? But then again, you can also see that you can get significantly faster training runs, because like from 16.2% to like 100%, there is very little um, gain, or gain in terms of word error rate, right? So uh, at least for speech, you might just be better off with just predicting 20% of the context, and so on, and so forth. um, and that in itself was quite interesting. There was also something about like target feature types, but that's just the same as predicting what you're predicting in itself. So that wasn't that interesting. But in my opinion, the most interesting bit was the context size, as well as like how many number of layers do you average your target in. And it also solves like a really important problem, specifically from like speech standpoint. If you look at the historical literature of Wave2Wave 2.0 or Hubert, wherein like you're pretty much at the beck and call of the layer that you select um, to learn from. So this sort of overcomes that challenge, and also significantly um, creates a significantly easier um, learning mechanism. Um, Before we call it a day, one thing that I would recommend everyone to read is this particular paragraph from the paper, which is representation collapse. Um, this is something which I, at least from like speech background, haven't seen a lot of papers talk about. But a lot of large models have this tendency to collapse when they're either pre-training. Uh, Typically, when they're pre-training, collapse means that the model just stops learning, or like learns something as trivial as just next time step prediction, or something like that. So. Uh, or it just learns to or just like stops to learn, or and just like predict like uh, just like randomized representations and so on, right? And they basically did like a really nice analysis on like what caused representation collapse in all of their runs. And like the first was that in case the learning rate was too large or the learning rate warm up was too short, then the student model would effectively collapse. Then they found that specifically for like highly correlated um, targets, like for example speech, wherein like everything is dependent on the previous um, time step. In those kind of scenarios, it is quite likely that the model just learns to predict the next time step and does not really care about the overall context. So in case of speech, over there they address this by normalizing the target representations, again the same way as Wave2Wave 2.0 does. So I found that like really interesting. I've never like I've seldom come across a representation collapse section within a paper, so I found this to be like quite interesting. But yeah, with that, um, thank you so much for tuning in, and I'm still around if you have any questions. But yeah, that's pretty much it from my presentation. And if you don't have questions, then you can of course leave.